Welcome to the Truth Over Comfort show. Today's guest is Jeremy Hammond. He is here to talk about Israel, the current conflict, the destruction of Gaza, some of the Israeli rhetoric about that and some of the implications, and just kind of other relevant topics around that, including some of the contents of his recent articles. I'm really pleased to have you here today, Jeremy. How are you doing?
Doing okay. All things considered, of course, still quite upset about the events happening in the Middle East, the atrocities taking place there, and particularly the fact that the government that claims to represent me is supporting it, supporting Israel's genocide in Gaza. That aside, I'm personally doing okay, but obviously these things affect us.
Yeah, so do you just want to tell people, first of all, before we kind of get to that, a little bit about yourself and your work? And yeah, just let people know who you are.
Sure. Well, I kind of got started doing research into foreign policy after the events of 9/11. That kind of led to me speaking out against the Iraq War, where of course they were using 9/11 as a pretext to wage war against Iraq. I was warning that the government was lying, that there was no evidence that Iraq still had weapons of mass destruction. My focus on the Middle East, foreign policies in the Middle East, led to me taking an intense focus on the Israel-Palestine conflict, and I've written a number of books about that, a few ebooks, as well as my major book on the conflict, Obstacle to Peace, the U.S. role in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So it's been an area of intense research and focus for my work over this course of many years. For several years, up until October 7th of 2023, I had really shifted my focus 100% away from foreign policy to the topic of the medical tyranny at home. Even predating COVID, I was really focusing pretty much on like public health policies. But with the events of 10/7 and Israel's retaliatory response in Gaza, I'm back since then. It's been entirely all I have the bandwidth for is just trying to keep up with events on the ground. And the political circumstances, most recently, a light at the end of the tunnel. Well, I shouldn't say a light at the end of the tunnel, but a positive development. Really the only positive development I've really seen since this began is South Africa's application with the International Court of Justice, charging Israel with the crime of genocide at the ICJ. Which is a very positive development. It's what needed to happen. I applaud the government of South Africa for taking that step. So that's a little bit about my background as far as my work and my research.
Yeah, we could obviously get onto the South Africa case later. And yeah, as you obviously mentioned, obviously COVID and everything that goes there, it's crazy how quick things go. We went through, as me, I'm obviously 22. So, go through COVID just at the end of my kind of teenage years, straight into Russia and Ukraine. That's still, going on in the background, and obviously, a lot still there to talk about. And then, Israel now in the headlines, and it just feels like one thing after the other, and you can never, you start researching one thing to, let me understand the history of this, and then something else comes up, and you're like, oh, I really need to understand that. Yeah, first of all, I guess just to jump straight into it, with what's going on in Israel and Gaza, obviously, there's lots to talk about with, the lead up to it, October 7th itself, and, whether how justified or not you think Hamas's actions are. But I'd kind of like to just steer away from that. I've covered it a fair bit and it's been talked about. But I think what's quite important now is, the media obviously go along with a lot of what Israel states, it says, we're the most civilized army and we have all these balance and checks. But there's been a few kind of interesting articles, one from the New York Times and one from the Wall Street Journal, both basically with satellite images. I think the New York Times did it first, but the Wall Street Journal just did a follow-up kind of later into December, maybe the 1st of January. And it also includes kind of the data around the destruction of Gaza, which is quite staggering. Wherever you think about Hamas's attack, Israel's right to self-defense, all that considered, when you look at the satellite images, it's hard to justify it, as you've obviously said in your articles. So can you just talk people through that with, these articles and just the general destruction of Gaza? A lot of people obviously will follow this, but, how bad actually kind of is it on the ground, from what we've seen?
Yeah, I actually I haven't read the Wall Street Journal one that you just mentioned, so I'll have to look that up after this. But yeah, I actually wrote an article about the New York Times feature which was an interactive feature where they showed the satellite images of North Gaza. And they had a slider where you could just slide it back and forth, left and right, and see before and after of what it used to look like and what it looks like now. And the Israeli Defense Forces, the IDF, has literally just flattened entire huge areas of North Gaza. It just looks like a desert wasteland, where there used to be buildings, communities, schools. There used to be orchards, greenhouses, farmland, and it's all gone. It's just literally, it's like it's been turned into a desert wasteland, essentially. And this is part of, so you can see, I mean, there's rhetoric coming from Israeli officials about making Gaza uninhabitable. And so this is what we're seeing on the ground, is that they're actually executing their rhetoric. I mean, it's not mere rhetoric. So they're not just saying these things. I mean, the genocidal type of rhetoric that we see coming from Israeli officials, we're seeing on the ground that is actually what they're implementing in terms of the military operations. And so, and that's one thing. It's looking at satellite imagery is one thing. There's estimates. I don't know what it is today, but the last I looked, it was well over 60% of the housing stock in Gaza is damaged or destroyed from Israel's bombardment. You have a situation where it's approaching 90% of the population now, I believe, is internally displaced, where they are fleeing from place to place, trying to find, in very early in the operation, Israel had announced, warned the entire population of North Gaza to flee south while bombing the south. And ever since, it's been telling internally displaced Palestinians in the south to flee different areas. They flee to various schools, for example, like UN-run schools that are being used for shelters, and then they're told to flee those shelters and find other shelter elsewhere. I mean, it really is terrorism on a mass scale. I mean, we can talk about. You mentioned not wanting to maybe go too deep into details about like 10/7 or context, things like that. But just to state my position, of course, I'm absolutely opposed to indiscriminate attacks against civilians, period. It doesn't matter who's the perpetrator and who the victims are. It's just a universal principle that, the types of atrocities that Hamas committed on 10/7 are horrific. But we need to understand that Israel's terrorism against Palestinians occurs on an incomparably greater scale. As bad as 10/7 was, and it was the worst atrocity against Israelis, against Jews, as they say, since the Holocaust. At least that's what they've been saying, and I accept that's true. But obviously, none of the crimes, and we have a 75-year history of Israel systematically violating the human rights of the Palestinian people. But none of the crimes that Israel has ever committed against the Palestinians, either individually or collectively, justifies what Hamas did in murdering Israeli civilians on 10/7. Similarly, those attacks on 10/7 cannot possibly justify what Israel has been doing to the Palestinian people, just absolutely brutalizing them with openly genocidal intent. And so just this morning, looking at the death estimates, it's now over 24,000, which is minimal. We hear claims like, oh, we can't trust these numbers because they come from the Gaza Health Ministry, which is, of course, it operates under the Hamas, which is the governing authority in Gaza. This is not a serious argument. This is not a serious claim. You can go back to prior operations, Operation Cast Lead, Operation Pillar of Cloud, Operation Protective Edge. The Gaza Health Ministry, the UN agencies, and where I got those numbers was from the UN website this morning. And so UN agencies, international human rights organizations like Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, they rely on these numbers in their reporting, and they regard them as roughly accurate, because they have historically proven to be close approximations of the finally verified numbers. So it's just a propaganda claim to say that, oh, we can't trust these numbers, and Hamas, as though Hamas is just making them up. That Hamas is not making them up. This is data. It's dated from the health ministry. And it's a minimum, I say, because there are thousands of additional Palestinians missing. People don't know where they are. They're presumed dead, buried under the rubble. And so when we see the death estimates for Palestinians in Gaza, that's a conservative number. It's a conservative number. Tens of thousands additional injured, with Israel systematically targeting hospitals, similar to the situation in the shelters where there is no safe shelter. People, thousands of Palestinians internally displaced trying to find refuge at hospitals that have been systematically targeted. And again, they think that maybe if they stay on the grounds of a hospital, then they're going to be safe, and that has proven not to be the case. And they've been displaced from hospital grounds. There's 36 hospitals in Gaza. I don't know the current numbers, but the last time I checked, I believe only 11 of them were even partially operational. And this is precisely because of Israel's systematic targeting of the healthcare system in Gaza, ensuring that injured people cannot get care. You have children, well over 1,000 children, I believe. Again, last I looked, I'm not quite up to date with the most recent numbers, but well over 1,000 children having amputations without anesthesia, pregnant women giving birth without any, pain medication, having cesarean sections. I mean, it's just such a horrific, inhuman situation that's happening, and it very easily meets the definition of genocide under international law.
Yeah, I mean, you just mentioned there and before. I mean, I'm happy to kind of get to that and your argument behind that.
Yeah.
But before that, and again, I know I mentioned we don't have to go into what happened on the 7th of October, but Phil, any point if you feel it's relevant, I'm not saying we can't bring it up.
Sure.
Obviously, you've just given your position, which I agree with. And yeah, you should definitely read the Wall Street Journal article. It's got the satellite images, information of the destruction. I was just trying to get it up there while we're talking, but I'll put it up on the screen.
Okay.
It's something like, I think 85% of people who have left their house won't be able to return because it's damaged or destroyed. I think over 70% of the buildings are destroyed, and it goes through. It has World Bank data as well, so it's not even like they're using, if you want to say Amnesty International or Human Rights Watch on for your cup of tea. The World Bank, an American and Western, then organizations coming out with this data as well, covering the farmland as well, as you mentioned, the agriculture, along with the satellite images. And again, you can look at videos on YouTube going, drones through the streets, and it's just rubble. And then even some of that rubble's, getting, swept aside as well by demolition vehicles and stuff in Israel. So again, whatever you think about the situation, if you look at that, there's no way you can justify it. If you want to say, let them go after Hamas and other things like that, fair enough. But there's no way, the thing about Israel is they have this perfect PR/marketing line that's not really convincing, in that it convinces some people no matter what they do, it's always because Hamas are there. So the hospitals, the schools, there's always, Hamas were there. And, sometimes, obviously, there could be tunnels that go under these areas, or they could even be using areas like that. But every single instance, if you say, Hamas were there, it's like, well, every single building that you've bombed, every bit of farmland, when someone says everything's related to this, and it's always that, you've got to stop kind of believing that and taking that may not be the case. It's like the US doing strikes in Afghanistan, Iraq. They're like, there was a terrorist there. Well, you could just label some man, some male above the age of 18 a terrorist, and then it's justified. So definitely worth checking out that Wall Street Journal article as well, just because it's probably a couple weeks after. I think it was either January the 1st or the 31st of December. So it just has some more up-to-date data, because I guess it goes within the conversation of, in most wars, a month or a few weeks may not make a huge amount, difference for the infrastructure and the damage, but this is a weekly kind of drastic difference. And I think when I interviewed Kyle Anzalone last week, the most which is pretty incredible in the kind of small time frame. I was just going to ask you, how does this compare with other previous, recent-ish Israeli operations? Because a lot of people might think this is either kind of normal occurrence because they're not seeing all the damage. Like, Israel goes in there and they get out, and this is kind of a regular occurrence. And the Palestinians, they bounce back, and look at these restaurants, or in the open air prison. We can get to that as well, where kind of, we might as well say it now, where people say, well, clearly it's not an open air prison because they have, these nice buildings or this restaurant. And I always think, well, a prison doesn't necessarily mean there's not nice stuff. There's prisons in England where there's, pool tables and PlayStations, but it's about that the guards are in control of the area. You can't leave. Everything is routined and it's out of your control. You can have a restaurant or a pool table or wherever it may be in a prison area, but at the end of the day, it's about kind of their control on the resources, the rules, and everything. And I'd like to, the current Foreign Secretary, David Cameron, obviously previous Prime Minister, in 2010 said that Gaza was an open air prison. So just take it from him. I don't know, that was a long-winded kind of rant. But Israeli operations kind of damage-wise.
So in comparison to prior operations, so the one I'm most familiar with is Operation Cast Lead, because that's the one that I just extensively document in my book Obstacle to Peace. I do touch on the other operations, but not in such detail in that book. But that particular operation, I just document very extensively and repeatedly in numerous different chapters. I kind of come back to it because it was kind of an ongoing there were ongoing investigations into that one, and I read all the reports from the IDF, all the reports from UN agencies, Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, B'Tselem, Israeli human rights organizations. So that's the one I'm most well familiar with. So just for contrast, so Operation Cast Lead was from December 27, 2008 to January 18, 2009. It's a 22-day military operation. Casualty estimates were just under, I think it was 1,400, I believe, in terms of Palestinians killed during that 22-day operation, which was characterized by the deliberate use of disproportionate force. And this was an explicit policy, the deliberate use of disproportionate force, which is a subcategory of indiscriminate attacks under international law. Israel had essentially openly declared its intention to commit war crimes in Gaza during Operation Cast Lead, and they called it the Dahia Doctrine, which was the policy of deliberately using disproportionate force. So that's Operation Cast Lead. And then the next operation where there was an actual ground invasion, and there's been too many operations in Gaza to commit to memory, but the two big ones were Operation Cast Lead, and then in 2014, Operation Pillar of Defense. Or not pillar. I'm getting some confused. Pillar of Cloud or Pillar of Defense, it was called in English, was one in between. And then there was, Operation Protective Edge is the name of the one in 2014. And I believe the casualties there, and that was a 50-day operation. And the number of Palestinians killed in that operation, I believe, was about double that of Operation Cast Lead. I think it was in the area of 2,400. And that was a 50-day operation. Well, in Israel's current operation, just in the first 3 weeks after 10/7, there were already more children killed in Gaza than in all of the planet's conflict zones combined for each of the years 2019, 2020, 2021. I'm sorry, maybe it might have been 2020, 2021, 2022. Okay, so for each of the prior 3 years, there are more children just in the first 3 weeks of Israel's operation, more children killed than in all of the other world's conflict zones combined for each of those years. And looking at what would we expect if Israel was, the claim that Israel is targeting Hamas, and this is an operation that's targeting Hamas. Well, for people who actually believe that, I would ask them to look at the proportion of women and children killed, which is 70%. 70% of Palestinians killed in Israel's current operation are women and children, 70%. Well, that's exactly what you would anticipate. That's exactly what you would expect if Israel was just randomly bombing Gaza because that's roughly approximate to the proportion of women and children in the population. So this is a reflection that the proportion of women and children killed is a reflection of the indiscriminate nature of Israel's bombing. Over 2,000-pound bombs dropped on the one of the most densely populated areas on the planet. Back in, I think it was November, maybe it was back in October, the Jabalia refugee camp, which is the most densely populated area in Gaza, which again is one of the most densely populated areas on Earth. 2,000-pound bombs dropped on this refugee camp. I mean, this is not targeted warfare. It's not targeted warfare. Israel's operation is brazenly and blatantly and obviously targeting the entire civilian population. And Israeli officials have been open about that, apart from, of course, they put out these press release statements, right? These PR statements. That's just pure propaganda. This is an operation, we're targeting Hamas, and it's unfortunate that civilians are dying, but it's only because Hamas uses them as human shields. This is what they're told. So these are the types of statements that the US government requires the Israeli government to put out, to be able to say, the Israeli government, look at these statements. The Israeli government does everything possible to avoid harm to civilians. Meanwhile, we can see on the ground that the opposite is true. And of course, you go to the Israeli media, or you just look at statements that they make amongst themselves, or to the Israeli media, or in the Knesset, and how openly genocidal they have been in terms of, you have Netanyahu citing the Bible and the genocide in the Bible of the tribe of Amalek, and saying, that in characterizing the Palestinians, the Palestinians in Gaza as the Amalekites, which is just clear, unambiguous incitement to genocide. You have top military officials just talking about how, Gaza needs to be destroyed. Gaza needs to be flattened. They need to make Gaza uninhabitable. I mean, it's just, that type of rhetoric is what we've been seeing is put into operation on the ground. The claim that Israel does everything to avoid harm to civilians is so utterly ludicrous. It should be insulting to anyone's intelligence that we're expected to believe that. It's insulting to our intelligence as human beings who are supposed to be civilized, because you look at what they said from day one. We're going to block food, water, electricity, fuel. We are going to block basic needs that are necessary for Gazans to survive. We are not going to allow them to have those goods and services. Well, that's genocidal intent right there. And you get, even before you get into the discussion of the indiscriminate nature of the bombardment, there's the siege, and you have the World Food Program, several weeks ago announcing that half of Gaza's population is starving. You have the UN, the World Food Program, warning the world that there is now an imminent risk of outright famine in Gaza. So a man-made famine in Gaza as a result of Israel's blockade policy. And of course, he also, the same as how, the IDF will put out these press release statements, talking about how they try to avoid harm to civilians and all this obvious nonsense. And it's the same with the humanitarian aid situation. And Israel will like to say, oh, well, look, there's humanitarian aid going through Rafah, and now we've opened the Kerem Shalom crossing in the north of Gaza from Israel to allow in humanitarian aid because we're so wonderful and we respect Palestinians' lives, and we're facilitating aid. But the reality is that before 10/7, it required 500 truckloads of humanitarian aid into Gaza on a daily basis just to maintain subsistence level of survival in Gaza. And last I looked, again, I'm not up to date on the most recent numbers, but the last time I looked, it was about 100 trucks a day, and that was after with the two crossings open, after they finally opened the one in the north as well as the one from Egypt, which is the Rafah crossing, which doesn't even begin. It's almost like a cynical PR ploy to say that we're allowing in humanitarian aid, because it doesn't even, it's just a trickle compared to, there was 500 trucks before on a daily basis. And then there was this massive bombing campaign that's just destroying Gaza and creating this humanitarian catastrophe. And so the number of trucks needs to have increased, many-fold. And yet it's been decreased many-fold. So, yeah, this idea that there's, Israel is doing the humanitarian thing by allowing in aid, and that again is only because of U.S. pressure. So the U.S. exerts a little bit of pressure, like this tiny amount of pressure on Israel to take a few steps just to be able to make it politically feasible for the U.S. to continue supporting this genocide. And so that's why they opened the crossing in the north, for example. It really is a cynical PR ploy that anyone who actually knows is paying really any attention to what's actually happening can see right through. It's totally transparent. Now, as far as the claim that civilians only ever die in Gaza because they're being used by Hamas as human shields. Well, okay, let's look at Operation Keslet. This is not a new claim. It's the same claim Israel makes in every one of its operations. So go back to Operation Keslet. Of course, once again, that operation was characterized by indiscriminate attacks against the civilian infrastructure and deliberate use of disproportionate force to punish civilians and to terrorize civilians. All right. So, and of course, in every instance of a hospital or a school or some, civilian infrastructure being struck in Israeli strikes, we were told that it's because Hamas uses the civilian infrastructure to hide behind, and it fires from schools and it fires from hospitals and it uses civilians as human shields. Well, these allegations were looked at. There were numerous investigations by UN agencies, including a UN fact-finding mission headed up by a self-described Zionist who happened to be from South Africa, Richard Goldstone, as well as international human rights agencies, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, again, Israeli human rights agencies like B'Tselem, all investigating these claims and these allegations, and looking at the IDF's own reports from its own self-investigations into the conflict, where it was trying to justify its operations, and there wasn't a single documented case in that entire 22-day operation of Palestinian civilians dying because they were being used by Hamas as human shields. Not a single documented case. So what you had was again and again and again these incidences of civilian infrastructure and persons being targeted and struck and killed without any possible military justification. That was Operation Cast Lead. Okay, it's no different today. This claims that, well, Palestinian civilians only die because they're being used as human shields. Well, essentially, when you hear that, the term human shields is being used in a way that has no relationship to its meaning, its definition under international law. So when you hear the claim that Hamas uses human shields and that's the only reason Palestinians are being killed, the term human shields is being used as a euphemism to mean any Palestinian civilians killed in Gaza by virtue of their being in Gaza. So it's a propaganda term that's being used to try to justify this massacre. And so, and you also mentioned, that was another bit of propaganda that we saw during Operation Cast Lead, and ever since, ever since 2005, really. There's this whole another propaganda narrative is that, well, Israel withdrew from Gaza in 2005, and look what I got in return, just rocket fire, and which is, again, just astonishingly dishonest, because Israel did not end its occupation of Gaza in 2005, and in fact, it increased after Hamas won Palestinian elections and became the governing authority. When it won parliamentary elections, there was a Hamas-led government, which the U.S. conspired with Israel and Fatah, the party of Palestinian Authority President Mahmoud Abbas, to try to overthrow the democratically elected government. When that failed, Israel escalated its blockade ongoing since the 1967 war to a state of siege, and blocking civilian goods entering into Gaza and controlling what goes in and out. And this has been the situation that, Israel has been occupying Gaza since 1967. It controls what goes in, it controls what goes out. And that didn't change in 2005. And even before, the blockade that began in like 2006, 2007, even before that. So you have in 2004, you have the head of Israel's National Security Council, Giora Eiland, describing Gaza as, quote, a huge concentration camp. That's Gaza. And that's a better description than the open air prison analogy, because of course, prisoners, at least ideally, have gone through a trial. They've been convicted of crimes, and found guilty, right? And of course, the entire civilian population of Gaza have not guilty of any crimes. Again, the purpose of the blockade was to collectively punish the civilian population for having Hamas as their governing authority, and this was explicitly, stated by Ariel Sharon's top advisor at the time, who said, Dov Weissglass, who said that it's like an appointment with a dietitian. Palestinians will get a lot thinner, but they won't die. And that was the purpose of the blockade. And at one point, they were calculating the number of calories required. So they were calculating the number of calories required to prevent like starvation. And that was how they calculated the amount of food that they were going to allow through the crossings into Gaza, based on this, as Norman Finkelstein has appropriately described it, a starvation plus diet. They used to block things like chocolate, potato chips, A4 paper, notebooks for school kids. I mean, just ridiculous stuff that obviously has no military purpose whatsoever. And yet, but these were civilian goods. And this was the nature of Israel's blockade that has been ongoing, pre 10/7 for 17 years. So this idea that Israel withdrew in 2005 and that was the end of it, like that was the end of its occupation, is just more nonsensical, dishonest propaganda designed to try to justify Israel's continued brutalization of the Palestinians.
Yeah, I always find it kind of interesting on that one where is there an echo coming out your side? Yeah, where obviously they say, well, we left in 2005, like as if it's like a pat on the back, like you illegally occupied a territory, all your settlers left, and that's meant to be some big, pat on the back. Well done, you left somewhere that you shouldn't have been in the first place, and all these people who lived there shouldn't have been. And then you have, I can't remember who it was. I think it was an advisor to either Netanyahu or Sharon, who said, basically, this allows us, we can leave, actually bring the people out, but we can still obviously have control, by blockading it, allowing what comes in, all with the blessing of the US Congress, basically. Yes. We get a political win, it looks good, Congress voted for this, but we still, obviously retain control what goes in, permits to build things, permits, obviously, to work, all these lots of different things. They still obviously control what goes in and out. And as you mentioned there, the diet count as well, which is, a strange thing. There's also, they mentioned kind of keeping the economy on the brink of collapse. And this, a yes. good comparison, I guess, would be the sanctions on Iraq after Saddam Hussein invaded Kuwait, and the collective punishment, obviously what sanctions are as well. You punish the population to try and force them to overthrow, Saddam Hussein or whoever it is, which normally never, ever works. It just punishes the population. Is a good comparison that everyone could probably look back and say, maybe that wasn't a good idea. There's always the quotes of how many children died and, the US government, saying it was justified. Similar thing again. And again, going back to kind of, the destruction of Gaza, you have Joe Biden, who's obviously come out and said they're doing, indiscriminate bombing, but you're not backing that up by saying, well, they're doing indiscriminate bombing, but we're still going to give them all the weapons they want. There's been a lot of US pressure, privately that's been reported, and most of the time Israel seems to not listen or finally give in. There's been recent reports of having a fallen out over the Palestinian authorities' tax money, and the finance minister went on Twitter and said, the US are our ally, but we're not doing this. So there's obviously some divisions there. But just going back to what you said, so you talked about some of the rhetoric from Israelis, where we've heard from the start, where you quoted obviously about the collective punishment of stopping water, electricity. The defense minister in that same sentence calling Palestinians or Gazans human animals. We've heard that a few times. You had the ex-Minister of Information. She went on Twitter, called them all monsters, to wipe them out. There's been calls to use the doomsday weapon, all these kind of calls for mass violence. You've used the term a few times, genocide. I haven't used it too many times myself, because you get kind of in a honeypot of explaining yourself. So why don't you kind of give your reasoning behind it? Feel free to give other examples. I'm guessing kind of your case would be the rhetoric they're saying and then their actions of actually carrying that out. Because it's not just because people talk about, there's Israelis who say horrible things, but they're on the fringe of society, kind of like, some neo-Nazis in the South America. They don't have power, but, you have the finance minister and the other one, I can't remember his name, Ben Gurvey, who come out all the time and say stuff. People in the Knesset, their kind of parliament, and people in the military making these comments that, you have the Israeli, general population, but a lot of the people, ex-military officials or current ones. You mentioned one of them who said about the concentration camp quote, and he's written some recent articles basically saying we need to purposely do a humanitarian crisis,
yes,
destroy Gaza. He's saying that now. He's no longer, in his kind of position of power he was as the head of national security. I can't, know the exact one. But so, do you just want to lay out your case of why you think it's genocide, and kind of some, the stuff you've written in your recent articles that kind of back up some of that. But if you just want to lay out your case, just why you think it's genocide specifically.
Well, let's just start with the definition. So I'm just going to read it here. So we're talking about the convention. So South Africa's case, of course, South Africa being a member of the genocide, it's called the Genocide Convention. The full title is the Convention on the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide. So that's the international treaty to which Israel is a member, the U.S. is a member, and South Africa is a member, and of course many other nations. So that defines genocide as any of a number of acts that are, quote, committed with intent to destroy in whole or in part a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And such acts can include, quote, killing members of the group, causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, or deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. So we can look at each of those criteria and see that they're easily met. So killing members of the group. Is Israel killing members, the group being Palestinians living in Gaza? Well, of course. Again, just within the first 3 weeks, more children killed than in all the other world's conflict zones combined. So it's not just that they're being killed in very large numbers, with, completely indiscriminate attacks. In fact, it's kind of an understatement to describe them as indiscriminate, because an indiscriminate attack could be that you're targeting a military object, you're just, without proper proportionality in terms of harm, incidental harm to civilians. I mean, that's not what's happening. It's almost inaccurate to even describe it as indiscriminate. I mean, Israel is targeting the civilian infrastructure. It's targeting the entire civilian population. So is Israel killing members of the group? Yes, obviously. Causing serious bodily or mental harm. Israel is absolutely terrorizing. It is absolutely traumatizing the population of Gaza. You consider children, the childhood population in Gaza and the trauma that they're undergoing. And it's systematic. It's absolutely systematic, including the targeted attack on the entire healthcare system in Gaza. So is Israel causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group? Absolutely, unquestionably. Is it deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part? Well, I mean, you see, again, you just mentioned how Giora Island has written not one or two, but he's written a number of articles in Israeli media where he was explaining what needs to happen in Gaza and what the military operation is aimed at. And he was very explicit and open in saying we need to make Gaza uninhabitable. We need to create a humanitarian crisis as a means to an end. And is that just rhetoric? No, it's not. It's what we actually see being implemented on the ground in Gaza. So is Israel deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part? Yes, absolutely. Very clearly and unambiguously. It's making sure that Gazans don't have homes to go back to. Because you have the situation where the population is over 2.2 million, and again, between 85 and 90%, I think at this point, of the population of Gaza are internally displaced. So another critical piece of context is that to begin with, the population of Gaza is 70%. 70% of the people living in Gaza are refugees from the 1948 ethnic cleansing by which the state of Israel came into existence, or their descendants. So it's already a predominantly refugee population, which is one of the reasons why they're so dependent on humanitarian aid, in addition to Israel's 17-year blockade, which is part of, I should say, 17-year siege, which was an escalation of the blockade that has been ongoing and occupation that has been ongoing since 1967. So you have this population of refugees that are being made refugees like repeatedly over and over and over again. They fled the north to the south, and then they had to flee from where they tried to take shelter in the south to where, God knows. There is just no safe place for them. They're being absolutely traumatized. And again, half the population, according to the World Food Program, is starving. It's a man-made famine in the works, and I just don't see how you could make a case that the criteria for meeting the definition of genocide have not been met. I don't see how you could make a case that they haven't been met, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I guess to say the word genocide, I'm not that I'm disagreeing or agreeing with you, but it does turn obviously some people off. Same with the word ethnic cleansing. I guess when people hear genocide, they think it has to be. I know there's been a lot of people who've died, but more, tens and hundreds of thousands. Obviously, it goes back to what the Nazis did and other groups where they killed a lot more people. I guess some people, the block, maybe even my own head, would be genocide. I would see, in the way that I understood it, not that I'm saying I did properly, is that it has to be the number has to be a lot higher. I know I guess you could be on a small population and intent and things like that, but so far, whether again you agree with what Hamas did or not, Israel's response has obviously gone way beyond.
Yeah, let me speak to that point. Yeah, it's a good point, because I mean, when we think of genocide, I mean everyone thinks of the Holocaust, right? And so people do have this kind of private understanding of genocide as being just like a mass slaughter, just like, and so there's this defense of Israel that you see often, that people will, on Twitter or wherever, you see people saying, well, like, if Israel wanted to commit genocide, everyone in Gaza would be dead by now. Israel would have just gone in there and just killed them all, and there's this kind of like counterfactual argument that, it can't be genocide because it's only 24,000, it's not out of a population of 2.2 million, and so there is this kind of argument. But number one, again, looking at the definition of genocide in the Genocide Convention, there isn't a criteria of like a certain threshold or number of deaths have to have occurred before some threshold for genocide is met. So that's just not the case. Also, we have to understand that Israel is perpetrating this genocide within the limits of what is politically feasible. And so what I mean by that is that, again, you have, number one, it's being facilitated by the United States government. This could not happen without U.S. support. If Israel wanted it to stop, or, I'm sorry, if the U.S. wanted it to stop, if the Biden administration wanted it to stop, it would be ended tomorrow. It's a phone call. It's a phone call. It's a phone call to end this. The reason it persists, the reason Israel is doing it, and the reason that Israel has been doing it with such impunity and with such brazenness is precisely because of the history of U.S. support for Israel's crimes against the Palestinians. Israel knows that it can get away with these crimes because it has the U.S. backing. The U.S. supports Israel's crimes militarily, financially, and diplomatically, including continuing to this day, blocking a ceasefire resolution in the Security Council, the UN Security Council. So Israel knows that it can count on the U.S. to defend it internationally against, against measures designed to hold it accountable. And we saw this again with, after the Goldstone report, with Operation Cast Lead, how the U.S. protected and shielded Israel against any kind of accountability in the international arena. So this is why people need to understand, this is why it's allowed to happen, because of U.S. support. Now, this is not to say that U.S. doesn't put some amount of pressure on Israel, like we already discussed, where, Biden is expecting Israeli leaders not to be like openly genocidal in their statements. It's expecting them to say things like, we do our utmost to avoid harm to civilians. It was the Biden administration kind of putting pressure on Israel to first open the Rafah crossing and allow aid in through in trickle amounts. But it was the minimal requirement that the U.S. required to be able to continue. Because the U.S. had to be able to say, oh, look, Israel is allowing aid in, just because there's also a question of political feasibility for the U.S. government. And this comes down to us. This is the point that I would really stress, is that to change that is up to us. And I say us, I mean we as Americans. Those of us who are American really have a duty and a responsibility. We have a government that's claiming to represent us, doesn't represent me, not in my name. But we need to make it politically infeasible for the U.S. to continue its policy of supporting Israel's crimes. So that's up to Americans. No government in the world is going to get that done. That's up to us. But so you have what the U.S. can is what's politically feasible for the U.S. to get away with in terms of its support, and there are limits to that. And of course, again, speaking to the point of how they have to be able to at least put out propaganda. They have to have this propaganda line, which requires them, okay, we're delivering aid, for example. So this is this PR campaign. So to be able to maintain this type of propaganda, the U.S. has certain requirements of Israel that Israel has met. Opening the Kerem Shalom crossing in the north is an example. So there's this minimal amount of pressure on Israel to take certain steps to make it easier on the U.S. government to support its genocide. So Israel is perpetrating this genocide right up to the limits of what is politically feasible. The very limits. Right up to the very limits of what's politically feasible. And so this argument that, well, if Israel wanted to commit genocide, there'd be a lot more Palestinians dead than there are currently. I mean, it's a non sequitur argument. It's a fallacy. And it also just ignores the political reality of, like, yes, there are limits. There is a certain amount of what is and what is not feasible for Israel to get away with. And it has been pushing the limits, obviously, as the case in the International Court of Justice illustrates. It has been pushing right up to the very limits of what it thinks it can get away with. So, yeah, that's the answer to that whole trope.
Yeah, no, I think that's a good point. And maybe others. Genocide in my head has always meant mass amount of deaths, and obviously you've given the definition. It doesn't include that. And again, you're right. They're doing it up the limit of what they half the population. Then it would be just too much, too obvious. They're doing it within kind of the arguments of, we're going after Hamas. just like, the US government can use, we did this bombing in pick a country because there's terrorists. That's the first kind of, reasoning behind it that people can get behind. But there's just no way they'd be able to kill 100,000 plus more people without, okay, this is a bit odd, how many people are dying. So I think that's definitely a good
and the
point.
other point is the humanitarians of the world are pointing out how there's probably going to be more Palestinians dying from things like malnutrition and disease than have died in the bombings. So it's not over. It's far. Obviously the military, the bombing is continuing at this point. But even if Israel was to stop the bombing tomorrow, I mean, we're still looking at an absolute humanitarian disaster, just an absolute humanitarian catastrophe. We have no idea what the final numbers are going to be, but it's horrific. The numbers of people who will certainly die, not just from the bombing, but from malnutrition, from disease, from outright starvation, lack of access to clean drinking water, etc. The lack of access to medical care, medical services, all of these things are compounding. So it's not just the number of deaths from the bombings that we need to be considering.
Yeah, and again, that would be, example of that would be in the 90s, the deaths in Iraq.
Yeah.
There was obviously bombings the US did half regularly and the UK too, but most of the deaths were obviously from the sanctions, a siege, whatever word you want to use it, the blocking of aid, money, them being able to strengthen their economy that kills people off, and caused by the bombing. There was a Washington Post article in 1991 where it talks about infrastructure, the water, everything, and then all the sanctions after that couldn't be repaired, and then the water system then in other places pops up, people can't have clean drinking water, the amount of food, and then it all just ticks up and more people die from that. But just going back to what we're saying there, but I know we're coming around towards so obviously we have the amount of destruction, on the country, not the country, the area, Gaza, all the buildings, the agriculture, the people, all of that. And I guess the argument for genocide or not is the intent. Some people will say, yeah, I can see all this destruction. Yes, I agree this many people have died, but it wasn't, on purpose. They was bombing this area because they tried to kill a mass, or that was an accident. It's about the intent, I guess, in people's minds. But you have that, say you don't believe that's the intent, but then you start reading and listening to some of these officials, what they're saying, and ex-officials, where the intent is, some of them will say, I can't remember his name, he was on CNN, a military guy, and he said there are no civilians in Gaza. Like, there's just no civilians. They're all legitimate military targets.
That was the Israeli president.
I think it was someone else as well.
Oh, yeah, probably, yeah. But the president as well had said, that there are no innocents.
I tried to correct you to the answer. The war is not just with Hamas. The war is with all the civilians that.
We are operating militarily according to rules of international law, period. Unequivocally. It's an entire nation out there that is responsible. It's not true. This rhetoric about civilians not aware, not involved, it's absolutely not true. They could have risen up, they could have fought against that evil regime which took over Gaza in a coup d'etat. But we're at war. We are at war. We're at war we are defending our homes. We're protecting our homes. That's the truth. And then when a nation protects its home, it fights. And we will fight until we'll break their backbone.
Yeah. Again, I'll put this all up on the screen. I'll put in the show notes. I'll play some clips as well if I can. But okay, so we have the destruction. We have some of the rhetoric from current and ex-officials. Some of the people, said they want to stop water, electricity, and then you top that off, I guess, with what they're also saying is about moving the population to the Sinai desert. that on top of it, I guess this is over, it's not some covert thing that, openly going on the TV and saying or writing articles about other countries taking the refugees or putting them in the Sinai desert in Egypt, moving the population because there's nowhere to go back, or we won't allow them to go back, either one. So if you add that all on, and again, this is very open about the Sinai desert, and it's been, I think, talked about before. And because people always do say, well, why don't, if the other Arab countries, cared, why don't they take them? Well, if the Arab countries take the population of Gaza, then Gaza no longer exists, and Israel will be very happy with that because they're gone. Even whether it was voluntarily, they was taken into countries and treated well, they're gone. So what do you make of kind of the Sinai desert? Do you think there's actually anything that's going to happen? Not because of political reasons, as in, is it possible politically, but could it happen just plainly because Gaza is inhabitable because of the bombing and the air, and it's just too far gone? Because Israeli officials, the defense ministers, talking about this going on through the whole of 2024. So if they've done this now, what's it going to be like at the end after they're done with all the area? So is this a realistic solution, and what do you make of it, I guess, within the argument of intent of this campaign? Was that part of the plan, I guess?
Yeah, I think initially the idea was to essentially force Palestinians through the Rafah crossing to live in tent cities in the Sinai desert, and Egypt just didn't participate with that plan, and so it was kind of scrapped because Egypt did not want to take responsibility for a humanitarian catastrophe caused by Israel. But it's still being openly talked about. I mean, you have Danny Danon, who's a member of the Knesset, the Israeli legislature, writing in, was it Newsweek or something, not just very recently, about his 5-point plan for post Operation Gaza, and he's talking. So now they're talking about a quote unquote voluntary migration of Palestinians to Arab states, to other countries, so they can voluntarily leave Gaza. But it's not really voluntary, is it? So and maybe that will happen to some extent. I want to speculate about to what extent that will or won't happen. I think it's plausible that there could be some that Arab states might take in some of the refugees, probably not in great numbers, I don't think. But the fact is it's not really voluntary when Israel has made sure that Palestinians in Gaza have no homes to go back to. I mean, in a sense, and I'm speaking to the point of genocide. I don't use the word lightly. I've never used the word to describe any other event in the history of the Israel-Palestine conflict, including the 1948 ethnic cleansing. Ethnic cleansing is a separate crime from genocide. There's a distinction between ethnic cleansing and genocide. But during the ethnic cleansing that actually started in 1947, after the UN Resolution 181, the partition plan resolution was passed, which was never implemented. But that's actually when the operations first started. So that by the time Israel, the Zionists declared the existence of the state of Israel unilaterally on May 14th, 1948, by that time, already 250,000 Palestinians had become refugees. By the time it was over and armistice lines were drawn in 1949, 750,000 Palestinians had become refugees. Over 500 Arab villages were literally wiped off the map. So Israel made sure that the Palestinian refugees had no homes to return to. It's done a similar thing in Gaza, where it has just leveled. Again, I think it's well over 60% now of the housing units in Gaza are damaged or destroyed. Well, this is deliberate. This is systematic. Israel is making sure that Gaza is uninhabitable. The major parts of the Gaza Strip they literally are uninhabitable now. So what is going to happen with Palestinians living in Gaza? This is a question for the international community to deal with. Obviously, there needs to be some kind of, where are they going to live? They're going to be dependent on humanitarian aid. There's no question about that. They already were, by and large. Most of the population was already dependent on humanitarian aid, and with this catastrophe just escalating the need greatly, I don't know what the answer is or what's going to happen. I don't think it's going to. I don't think what Israel wants, that there's going to be this kind of mass exodus of Palestinians from Gaza, and other countries are just going to take them in. I don't foresee that happening. I think more likely they'll be living in tent cities in Gaza while the international community tries to help rebuild Gaza and create housing, for refugees and delivering humanitarian aid. And they're going to try to just rebuild the way it was. But the thing is I think this is going to be a watershed event in that I don't think it's going to go back to the status quo that existed pre-10/7, where Israel was just continuing to perpetrate this occupation in Gaza, in the West Bank, where it was refusing to enter peace negotiations. And this, going back to the 2005 withdrawal from Gaza, and that was part of what was called the disengagement plan, Ariel Sharon's disengagement plan. So another aspect of the disengagement plan, essentially what it was Israel was basically saying, okay, we give up on the goal of settling Gaza. And so to be able to shift the resources and the focus and to gain the political leverage to advance the illegal settlement regime in the West Bank. Another aspect of the disengagement plan was that it was designed to essentially the Sharon administration's goal was to unilaterally define Israel's borders, which to this day remain undeclared, and Israel has no legally defined borders to this day, which incidentally is one of the criteria for statehood under international law. But people consider Israel a state, but it actually doesn't meet the definition of a state under international law because it has no legally defined borders, which is unique among nations. Because there are in other countries, there are border disputes, but typically, there are recognized borders that have been there is some legal basis for where those borders are placed. And you have a situation where Israel is essentially declaring, it's just a matter of fact that Israel controls all of the land between the river and the sea. You have Netanyahu, who has advanced the disengagement plan and taken it to the next level, where he has, he has had a strategy, a policy of utilizing Hamas as a strategic ally to ensure the continued division among the Palestinian leadership between Hamas and Gaza and the PA and the West Bank, and for the purpose of blocking any movement towards peace negotiations with the Palestinians. At the General Assembly in September, Netanyahu gave a speech talking about the new Middle East and his goals, and he held up a map of what he called the new Middle East. And guess what it showed? It showed Israel, no Palestine, no occupied territories, no West Bank, no Gaza, just Israel, encompassing the West Bank and Gaza from the river to the sea. So this is the situation where you have this apartheid regime, what has been recognized and described as apartheid by UN agencies, again, international human rights organizations, including Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch, again, describing it as well as Israeli human rights organizations as well, again, B'Tselem, Gisha, describing it as apartheid, because the reality is Israel does control all of the territory between the river and the sea. And you have a situation where the Palestinians are living in the West Bank. They live in these Bantustan-like enclaves where the PA exercises a certain level of autonomy, but within the framework of the occupation regime, within the framework of the Oslo Accords, where the PA was established under the Oslo Accords, essentially to serve as Israel's collaborator in enforcing its occupation regime. And then in Gaza, you have the people of Gaza essentially just locked away in the concentration camp, with Hamas serving as the prison guards on behalf of Israel. At least that's how Netanyahu viewed Hamas. Again, with him having an open, explicit policy of utilizing Hamas as a strategic ally to block any movement towards peace negotiations. So this is a situation. I just don't see things going back to that after this. I don't want to predict what is going to happen, but I think the world, essentially what I see happening is that there's just been kind of like the thin veil has been lifted and the true face of modern political Zionism is revealed. And so I think the world is going to be, I think the world is waking up and will wake up to what the Israeli state really is. And people have this kind of mythical in religious devotion to the idea, they have this idea of what they think Israel is, but that's not what Israel is. I mean, Israel was a state, there's a myth that it was founded through some kind of legitimate political process. A lot of times people say that the UN created Israel. This is all myths. Israel was not established through any kind of legitimate political process. It was established through the use of force and arms and by means of ethnically cleansing most of the Arab population from their homes in Palestine. That's how Israel was created. That's how Israel was established. And you have, and it's unabashedly today, an openly Jewish supremacist state. You can look at the Jewish nation state law that was passed in like 2018 or 2019, where they define, the Israeli government defines that the right to self-determination is an exclusive right of Jews in Israel. So this idea that Israel is this democracy, the Middle East only democracy, this is all a bunch of nonsense. If Israel was a democracy, it would be called Palestine. If Israel was a democracy, it would be called Palestine, going back to the Mandate era. We can examine the situation in the Mandate era and how the ethnic cleansing of Palestine was facilitated by the British belligerent occupation of Palestine for the specific purpose of denying the Palestinians the right to self-determination. And the Arabs proposed back then, their proposal was a single democratic state in which the rights of the minorities were protected under a constitution guaranteeing equal rights for all citizens. That's what the Arabs were proposing. The Zionists rejected it. The Zionists rejected a democratic solution in favor of ethnically cleansing Palestine. So this is the true face of Zionism. This is the reality, what Zionism is. Israel is a Zionist regime. It's an openly Jewish supremacist state. And I think that, civilized human beings, we were supposed to, this is the 21st century, that we're not supposed to be like glorifying this type of government. When South Africa was an apartheid regime, the international community condemned it and criticized it and brought it to an end. And yet you have this situation where there's just this glorification of this racist regime in Israel. And I think people are starting to see through the propaganda spin and lies that are used to try to conceal that. And again, it's just always been a thin veil. And people who are deceived by it are deceived by it because they allow themselves to be deceived, because the truth is for anyone who wants to scratch the surface, the truth is right there. And yet I think at this point it's become impossible to maintain that kind of facade. That Israel is this great democracy and it upholds human rights. And you had, I just watched today. It was they had done it Friday, so Thursday South Africa presented its case, arguing in favor of provisional measures by the ICJ to call on Israel to cease its operations. Israel provided its defense on Friday. I just happened to watch it. And they make the claim, they're arguing how Israel always respects international law, and it's just a farce. I mean, they're speaking to the ICJ, and the people at the ICJ can see right through that. You had a case in 2004 where the ICJ, at the request of the General Assembly, looked at the question of Israel's occupation in its construction of a wall in the West Bank, and the ICJ affirmed that Israel is in violation of international law, that the settlement regime is illegal, that the wall that Israel is building, basically an annexation wall, is illegal. It's a violation of international law. So here you have, it just shows the hubris of Israel, like declaring before the International Court of Justice that Israel is a law-abiding state. It's a farce. And everyone at the ICJ knows it's a farce. Everyone listening to the Israeli lawyers trying to defend this crime against humanity that's happening can see right through it. But this is the best Israel can do in terms of a defense. I think at this point, like all of these types of lies and propaganda, it's just becoming impossible to sustain anymore. And so I think that's going to be one of the consequences. So, it's a tragic situation, and the tragedy is going to continue. But I think at least there is hope that the situation is not going to go back to what it was, where the Palestinians were just languishing in the concentration camp in Gaza and in their enclaves in the West Bank, where and it just continues and continues and continues with U.S. support as Israel continues to expel more and more of them from their homes in the area of East Jerusalem, the settler attacks on Palestinians in Gaza, et cetera, et cetera. I think it's a positive thing that it's not going to go back to that. I think the international community is going to cease tolerating it. And I think it's going to bring a lot of pressure to bear on the U.S. I think there's hope that the situation could change where U.S. support will not be able to continue. I talked about how we need to make it politically infeasible for the U.S. to continue supporting Israel's crimes against Palestinians. And I think that's kind of the silver lining of this, is that there is an opportunity here to bring about that paradigm shift.
Well, that's definitely well summed up. Just to make a few comments on what you just said before we finish up. So, yeah, for one, for Israel, being for international law, I mean, they occupy multiple territories illegally, including the Golan Heights in Syria, where they get a third of their water, which you can read about on the Israel Embassy website. Obviously, they mentioned about apartheid. You had two ex-Israeli ambassadors to South Africa call it apartheid. You have ex-Mossad and IDF, officials also calling it apartheid. For your mention about, being a Jewish supremacist state, it has, I think, 1 or 2 million Arabs who are Israeli citizens. And there was an attempt to put a law through in, I think, 2020, somewhere around that, to give them equal rights to the Israeli Jews, not the West Bank, not Gaza, actual citizens of Israel. It got rejected. And for Netanyahu's speech at the UN, I actually watched that last week because I kept hearing Scott Horton bring it up, so I thought I need to watch it. It was his speech before, obviously, this happened. As you said, he holds up a map. There's no West Bank, Gaza, or Palestine. It was reported at the time. His whole speech is basically about how before the Palestinians had a veto on formalization with the Arab states, because the Arab states said there needs to be a Palestinian state before we can, make a deal. He said that's no longer the case. The Abraham Accords with Morocco, where they now have sovereignty over the Western Sahara. You have the UAE and also Bahrain, and then obviously the Israeli-Saudi normalization deal that's happening. And again, in all these deals, it's never like, oh, the Palestinians got what they want. The article explicitly says the UAE got promised F-35s, and it also mentioned in there that the assassination of Soleimani, the Iraqi general in Iraq, was also a factor in it because it showed the US was willing to stand up to Iran. All this stuff that has nothing to do with it. And basically his whole speech, he doesn't obviously mention that specifically, but the whole speech is basically the Arabs are basically willing to formalize relations at the expense of the Palestinians. You can hear him say it's interesting, is obviously the hubris of it as well. But before we kind of leave it there, do you just want to tell people where to find yourself? I'll put your books in the show notes up on the screen. And after the show, if you could just email me a few other books, you'd recommend about the subject, I'll put that in the show notes and get to myself as well. But I'd like to thank you for coming on. Really appreciate it. But yeah, if you could just let people know where to find yourself.
Sure. So my website is jeremyrhammond.com. And if you head there on the homepage or any of my article pages, you'll see a form to sign up for my newsletter. So definitely sign up for my newsletter. And my main book on the conflict is Obstacle to Peace, the U.S. Role in the Israeli-Palestinian Conflict. I've got a number of other shorter books that I have written. The first one I wrote ever actually was The Rejection of Palestinian Self-Determination, which specifically looks at the Mandate era. I've also got a shorter ebook called, long title, but a short book. It's titled Benny Morris. It was an article originally, and then I made an ebook out of it. It's Benny Morris's Untenable Denial of the Ethnic Cleansing of Palestine, which looks at the case of Israeli historian Benny Morris, who writes through the lens of being an ideological Zionist, who has documented the ethnic cleansing of Palestine, only to in kind of more recent years tried to deny that ethnic cleansing occurred, but his denials are untenable. And I go and show how his denials are untenable by looking at his own research, you can see that his claim is just ridiculous. His claim that it didn't occur is ridiculous. And of course, he had previously acknowledged that it did occur. So he was being honest originally, and then later he tried to backtrack. But anyhow, that's another short book I've got. And I've also got one called Exposing a Zionist Hoax, which takes a look at another book that was written by a Zionist, an American writer, who just basically just like rolled out all the propaganda tropes from like 48 to contemporary events. And so I just kind of go through one by one and just knock each of those propaganda tropes down and show how it really is just a hoax, all this propaganda. So that one is a really good compilation of all the main Zionist propaganda talking points. So I have those books, but the main one, again, is Obstacle to Peace. So head to my website, jeremyhammond.com, and you can purchase copies of that book directly from my website.
Sure. Yeah, I'll put that all up on the screen and the show notes. But again, thanks for coming on. I appreciate your time. You've given me over an hour, backed up your case, whether people agree with you, whether it was genocide or not. They could at least take into account, the destruction, whatever term or phrasing you want to use is kind of up to you. But yeah, thanks for coming on. And again, just appreciate your time.
Thank you. Appreciate it.